here today with Kaya Oakes. Kaya is the author of 4 books, most recently including The Nuns Are All Right and Radical Reinvention. Her 5th book, The Defiant Middle, How Women Claim Lives in Between, How Women Claim Life's In-Betweens to Remake the World, is forthcoming from Broadleaf Books later this month. Kaya's essays and journalism have appeared in the New Republic, Slate, Foreign Policy, The Guardian, The Washington Post, Sojourners, National Catholic Reporter, Commonweal, Religion Dispatches, Tricycle, On Being, America, and many other publications. She was the co-founder of the award-winning arts and culture magazine Kitchen Sink and is currently on the editorial board of the groundbreaking religion website Killing the Buddha. Kaya has also spoken and led writing workshops in church basements, community centers, homeless shelters, in senior centers, and with Writing for Your Life. She's one of a select number of international journalists who traveled to Rome and the Vatican in 2016 to study writing on religion in politically turbulent times. Since 1999, Kaya has been a faculty member in the college writing programs at UC Berkeley, where she teaches creative nonfiction, composition, and research writing. She's also been a distinguished visiting writer in nonfiction at St. Mary's College, as well as guest faculty at Bellarmine University in the Jesuit School of Theology at the Graduate Theological Union. She's also a trained spiritual director, and you can learn more about Kaya at www.oakestown.org. That's OAKESTOWN.org. So welcome, Kaya, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. You read the long, exhaustive bio.
Well, it's because you've got so much to talk about. My goodness.
I know.
What you've done. It's
it
wonderful.
Just keeps going and going and going, which is nice because it's nice to get older and still be productive, as we were talking about at the Writing for Your Life conference last week. So.
Yes, absolutely. We're very fortunate. So, but tell us more about your background. I mean, that was still kind of a broad, top of the waves kind of thing.
Sure. So I was born and raised here where I'm talking to you from, which is Oakland, California, in the East Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area. And I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I was raised Catholic by some very social justice oriented civil rights activist parents. My mom is a retired Oakland school teacher, and my dad passed away, but worked also in education. So I had a very literary and spiritually fused background as a child. To me, writing and reading always came hand in hand with belief and conversations about belief. And so it was a pretty easy transition into being a journalist and writer about religion, but I took a 20-year detour between I would say high school and my late 30s into being an arts journalist. I earned a master's degree in poetry and then tried that for a while. Wasn't that great at it. They still gave me the degree, but and then I co-founded this magazine that you mentioned called Kitchen Sink. That was one of the first magazines about the Bay Area art scene that was focused and done in the East Bay rather than San Francisco. And then when that ended, I wrote a book about indie and DIY culture, and that was my first nonfiction book. Whilst I was writing that book, I got interested in questions about religion again and ended up writing a memoir about my return to my Catholic practice. And since then, I've been a religion writer pretty exclusively. I still write about the intersections of culture and religion. I'm really interested in questions of how do people live out religion rather than what do people believe, but how do they enact that belief?
Wow. It's a very fascinating career, that you've put together, touched on several different bases, but, all the religion writing that you've done has been, quite a contribution.
It's been fun. And I think that's the bottom line, is like discovering something that you enjoy. I always thought that it would be, when I was a child, sitting through like catechesis with Sister Frances Freeney in 3rd grade, God rest her soul. But like, I just thought, I'm not interested in this. I hate this. This is boring. And then as an adult, you often find yourself turning around and re-examining things from your childhood and going, wow, actually, like recently I've gotten back into solo backpacking, which my parents love to do, going backpacking. And my mom sent me off into the woods when I was a teenager by myself. And I thought I just hated this. And then, a couple of years ago, I was like, I actually really love this. And it's similar with religion writing. It was like, I thought I hated it, but I actually really, I would say I enjoy writing about it.
Well, how many children, when they're growing up will hate whatever it is that their parents tell them to do. And then later on,
Yeah.
it's like they follow in their parents' footsteps in one way or the other.
And I'm also a teacher, right? So like it really, the apple really didn't, the acorn in my case didn't, not only did it not fall far from the tree, but it pretty much just landed at the feet of the tree. So yeah.
So before we get into the new book, you touch on, some of your previous books. Can you tell us about those a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So like I said, I did my MFA in poetry at a small liberal arts Catholic college here in the Bay Area called St. Mary's College. And whilst I was there, I was studying and reading a lot of prose poetry and getting interested in manipulating the poem form into more essayistic kind of writing. And that I later discovered is called creative nonfiction, but my school didn't have a track in creative nonfiction, so I couldn't do that. So I ended up with the poetry degree. Anyway, so I did publish a book of poems in 1990. I can't even remember. I think it was 2000 and I was like 36. So yeah, I can't math, but it was, a small press and not very many copies were printed, and typical first book, like nobody heard of it and it disappeared, and publisher went out of business some years ago. You can still buy it on Amazon for like a penny. But then when my friends and I started this arts and culture magazine shortly thereafter, and I was writing some essays for that, and a literary agent happened to pick it up in New York because it was, it had really good word of mouth. It won the Utne Independent Press Award, and because it combined art and comics, and we're kind of on the verge of the graphic novel thing. So all of our magazine was illustrated rather than having photographs. So it was a very unique publication. So she was a young agent. She was just in her internship. And she picked it up and read this essay I wrote about music, the music class. I teach a class at Berkeley on music and social movements. And she really liked the essay and said, do you want to write, have you ever thought about writing a nonfiction book? And I was like, no, I have this poetry degree. And I spent all this money getting it, but she said, I think your essays are really good and compelling and that you have a story to tell. And that's how I ended up writing Slanted and Enchanted. And that came out in a while ago. I was 40. So no, I was 38 when that book came out. So 12 years ago. And that was a much bigger deal. Book tour, national publicity. It was on Henry Holt, which is a big New York publisher. Unfortunately, it came out the year that Amazon released the Kindle, and so the book business sort of went bananas. And like again, it was a weird year. When I told a friend of mine who works in publishing I had a book that came out in 2009, she just went, "Oh." Like and shook her head.
It was also like the big depression or recession.
The recession, yeah. So it was people couldn't afford to buy books. I mean, not only were we
other things.
Yeah, the ebook wars started. And by the way, I'm not against ebooks. Like I think anything, and audiobooks I enjoy too. Anything that can get people paying attention to a book is great. But just the way that publishers handled it was just panic. So I mentioned that around that time I got interested in religion again, and I wrote to my agent and I said, what do you think about this idea of writing a memoir about what does it mean to rediscover faith as a kind of aggressively secular person, and she was like, yeah, that sounds really interesting. And it just, nobody wanted to publish it. And then, so she sent it out like 10 times. And then this editor at Counterpoint, which is now called Catapult and is now part of Penguin Random House, but in the past was a secular independent publisher that has a long, long history of doing great books. Wendell Berry was one of their main authors. Wow. So this editor there was a lapsed Catholic, and it really resonated with her. And so I wrote that book for them. And then Orbis, which is a theological publisher, Catholic progressive theology. They do a lot. If people who watch this are familiar with people like Gustavo Gutierrez or James Cone, they were the American publisher of a lot of the Latin American liberation theologians and Black liberation theology. So they asked me to write a book with them. And obviously, because it's a theological press, they didn't pay me very much, but it was really a labor of love for me because I really wanted to write that book on the nuns. It was, again, based on an article that caught the attention of an editor. And fast forward to, there was a little gap there. Over the last 6 years, I was working on a book proposal about the religious left, and my colleagues, two of my friends and co-journalists had similar books coming out. And I was like, there's too many of these, and they were in competition. And so I ended up dropping that book proposal, and then an editor at Broadleaf was at the Glen workshop where I was teaching, which is a workshop for spiritual writers. And she and I had lunch, and she said, I've been wanting to work with you for a while. Like, what are some things you're thinking about? And so we just kind of hashed out some ideas. And she also had been reading my freelance work. So one thing I recommend to people who want to write a nonfiction book is to just publish as much as you can, because and pitch your work, because most publishers will not publish a book from somebody who doesn't have a platform, but also like some body of work. And that's how editors often find books. So in my case, that's how my agent found me. That's how editors have found me.
Wow. Well, good for you. Well, you were out there a lot. You were publishing a lot of different places. All those, newspapers and other publications that I read off, and and more. And so I'm not surprised that people found you. And obviously you were right on things that were topics that people cared about. So
I think that's another thing I really work with my students on is why you, why now, why this story, right? Which everybody in journalism knows that, and everybody but a lot of creative writers don't think about that. They don't think about timeliness or news pegs. And when I work with scholars, I give workshops at schools pre-pandemic, and I just started sort of doing it again on Zoom. Schools will sometimes hire me to come in and talk to their theology or religion faculty about writing for a broader public. And that's one of the things we talk about is, maybe your expertise is on Quaker abolitionists, but like, what's a story in the news right now that relates to that? And then, if you have a religious group that's going out and opening up their church to immigrants, boom, here's a story that relates. So I think for creative writers, it's that newsy kind of thinking is like, who cares? So what? Those are really hard questions to answer for a novel, for a poem. Trust me, I tried myself. But you do have to be able to think a little bit more about, why you, why now, why this story, right? So who's going to read it? Why should they be interested? Those are good questions to ask yourself.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's get to the new book, and let me try to read the title again.
Defiant that's okay.
The Defiant Middle, How Women Claim Life's In-Betweens to Remake the World. Yeah. So how did that book come about? What inspired you to write that?
Well, as I mentioned, I had a conversation with Lil Copen, who and a lot of people, in our world of religion writing, Lil is very well known. She is formerly at Erdman's and now and Broadleaf, which is this new trade imprint of Fortress Press, which used to do mostly scholarly books. And she's just got so we hired a new lecturer in my program a couple years ago who's a medievalist, and it turns out that Carmen had done a couple books with Lil as well. So like that's how small the world is. Like
Really?
Carmen Butcher, Acevedo Butcher, she's got also got a book coming out with Broadleaf next year that's a translation of Brother Lawrence, who was a mystic, and she's done translations of the Cloud of Unknowing and things like that. So you wouldn't think that an editor who was interested in those books was interested in what I wrote, but they're not that narrow. That's one thing people don't realize, is that editors are constantly looking for different ideas, because they're kind of like a dog or a cat that's got its nose in the air smelling for interesting smells, right? And it's not that predatory, but it is this curiosity of like, what are people thinking about? What are people talking about? So Lil had read, I wrote a couple pieces that were more creative nonfiction-y on feminism and women. And then I had also been doing some reported work on women in the church, in the Catholic Church, and for years writing about things like nuns and social justice activism. And so we kind of drilled down to this idea of like, what does society and religion expect women to be, think, do versus what we really experience? And that was it. That was basically the proposal, right? And so for those who've never written a book proposal, you have an idea, and then you submit some sample chapters and an outline. And so my outline was super vague. It was, I can't believe, but they were interested enough to buy the book anyway. And then we signed the contract like February 2020. So of course we all know what happened next. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to spend lockdown writing this book, but I actually didn't, because, nobody was productive for the first 3 or 4 months of the pandemic. So I really got going that summer, and I worked with I don't have a writing group per se, but I have friends who are writers, and 3 of us agreed that we would meet on Zoom and just do a check-in. And that's what we did throughout the pandemic. And it was super, super helpful.
Wow. Isn't it wild how these different books come to fruition?
Yeah.
Each one has a different, unique story.
Yes, absolutely.
So, the question of audience, right? Kind of who are you writing it for, so to speak? How did you decide that question in this case?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, because it's something I think about a lot. And I actually read on Twitter recently, it was like, retweet with your most controversial writing take. And one of the responses was, don't think about audience because it's really bad for your writing. And I was like, actually, that's not good, because Lil and I talked about this a lot in revision, and your editor is very concerned about that question because they want to sell books. And also we talked a lot about like so if we originally the book started with this chapter on age, and she's like, well, if I were a millennial and that came first, I wouldn't want to keep reading. And I'm like, oh, yeah, okay. So we swapped the 2 chapters. There's one called Young, one called Old, and we swapped those in thinking about audience. Again, the gateway, because more people have been a young person than have been an old person, right? So like you can reach more readers that way. And I ultimately think writing should be a conversation. And otherwise, the problem is that it can come off as narcissistic or just, very much about the writer's interior life and like, who cares again? And so I think about audience a lot. I think, am I alienating anybody? Am I saying anything that is going to, am I alienating the right people, right? Am I driving away the readers I don't want? And I did more deliberately try to draw some lines with this book with like, I don't want you to read this book if you're homophobic or, don't believe in feminism, because it's not going to convince you and you won't enjoy it. You'll just be angry. And so, hopefully people can figure that out. But I also thought about, I do want men to read this book. I want them to be in this. I want to have a conversation with men about what it's like to be a woman. And particularly in religious settings, like, what does that mean? So I was very grateful that a longtime friend of mine who's a Jesuit priest just read it and really liked it. And not just because I wrote it and we're friends, but actually was like, oh, I learned something from this. I'm like, exactly. But it wasn't hostile. It wasn't like, I don't like you. So when I teach writing, which is my job, I talk a lot, and I'm in fact going to talk to my students about this tomorrow. It's like, who's going to read your essay? What are they going to take away from it? What do you want them to take away from it? And I have those conversations with editors too. So yes, I do think writers should think about audience. And for fiction writing and other forms of creative writing, I can see that worry of like, it's going to infiltrate your art too much and that pressure. But it's not about commercial like audience. It's more just like making your writing more accessible, right? And rather than, oh, I hope that 1 million people read this, that would be nice. But it's more just like, if 100 people do, are they going to understand it?
Yeah, I mean, since I come from a business, and marketing background, the whole idea of audience is incredibly important. I mean, it's kind of like, you can't just put something out there that is quote unquote for everyone, right? You've got to have a target. You've got to have things that particular group of folks are going to be specifically interested in. And so a book, especially a nonfiction book, is marketing ideas, right? Mm-hmm. So, again, if you don't really have an idea of who it's, intended to serve, then, it'd just be all over the place. So I think it's incredibly important for
that's and sorry to interrupt, but that's baked into our book proposals, right? So like when, again, for those who've never written one or are thinking about pitching a book, they ask you, who's your audience for this? Is it, and then you imagine, what I always tell people is imagine a Venn diagram, right? So like in one circle is like your church audience, maybe if you're doing spiritual writing, or your spiritual audience. But on the other hand, it's like your book should be able to be read by people outside of your denomination or your particular religious tradition. And then another circle would be like, book clubs or, we all complain about marketing because it's and for people with business backgrounds, it comes naturally. But for writers, we're kind of like, oh God. But
absolutely.
You can do it and not do it in a toxic way, where you're pandering to people. And I think one thing that I've learned a lot about writing about nuns, N-O-N-E-S, people who are, outside of church, is that one of the things that drove them away is that sometimes churches don't seem very authentic. And so as writers, like, I think it's important for us to be authentic in our platforming and our social media use. So I'm constantly talking about like, hey, like today I put up this flyer for my online book launch and it doesn't have the date on it, or it has the date, but not the time. And I was like, this is what happens when you ask writers to market ourselves, LOL, right? Like that, but I'll fix it and repost it later. But that moment of like, I don't know what I'm doing, again, is a way for me, again, to say to my audience, like, this is who I authentically am, is somebody who makes stupid mistakes like that. And funny enough, I'm married to somebody who works in tech and is very conscious of, how things look and appear online. And I showed it to him while I was working on the fire, and he didn't notice that either. So I'm like,
that's pretty
so
good.
There's two of us here.
Well, one of the topics during our last writers conference was marketing as a spiritual practice. And, it's kind of an effort to help people get past this concern about self-promotion. Because marketing doesn't have to be done that way. It doesn't have to be about me. It doesn't have to be about, being salesy or pushy or slimy or whatever else, right? You can do it in a way that is very helpful for your audience.
I agree. It's been a struggle. I'm very introverted. I'm like, you go down the list of like, progressive Christians love to talk about the Enneagram and like, Myers-Briggs. And I'm just like checking off every one of those of like, I'm not comfortable with self-promotion. I don't like it. But the fact of the matter is I understand it's my job. And I've tried to separate, like, I'm uncomfortable with this, but also if I don't do this, you won't get to read my book. And the fact is I didn't write the book for myself.
Yeah,
exactly. I didn't write it. Yeah. It's like, if I would have just self-published it then and printed one for my mom and, and that's it. But like I wrote it because I think it will, and this is something that, again, my therapist would confirm, is that I see my writing as altruistic. Like I see my writing as a way as something that will hopefully help people. And that's why I spent 10 years doing, journalism and reporting on things like homophobia in the Catholic Church or immigration or, issues that people were needed to be made more aware of. And so I hope that my readers will understand that the marketing stuff is just the way things have to be. And I think a lot of us are being more frank about that and on social media and saying things like, look, my publisher's not doing this for me because they can't. They don't have enough money. They don't have enough staff. And so this is my job. And so I'm going to make a few mistakes. But I think that kind of thing is helpful to people to hear because it makes it less intimidating for other people. And you're right, especially in the realm of spiritual writing, there is this kind of like, we can't all be monks living in a cave, I mean, I would love to, trust me, but like you can't sell your book that way. And if you did write the book as a way to as a gift to people, yes, they have to pay for it, but I always hope people will pass my books along, donate them to a library, give them away when they're done reading. Something like that. I encourage people to do that kind of thing. But beyond that, it's like, I got to put myself out there for you to know. Otherwise, you don't know who I am and what I wrote. And so for me, thankfully being Gen X, like irony and like comes very easily to me. Self-deprecation comes very easily to me. And people kind of find that more charming than the sort of Trumpian like side, like that narcissistic ego thing. And people can spot a fake too, even though they may have a big following in spiritual writing. There's a lot of people whose platforms I find kind of off-putting because it's like so obviously crafted and marketed, and especially with Instagram, like this perfection, this perfected image. And then that is, again, that comes off very inauthentically, much like when churches are chasing after non-believers and saying, we're the place for you, and they go, no, you're not.
So how would you say the book is structured?
So I mentioned Lil and I working a lot on the outline, and that was partly because, like I said, when I sold it to broadly, unusually for most books that I've sold, I had a more structured outline, but because I've in the past written research nonfiction or memoir, which has a more of an arc, right? With this book, because it's researched, reported, and some personal stuff in. So it's not one of those things. It was a lot harder to impose an order on it. So literally the true story is that during the lockdown, I was like on an exercise bike in my garage in the dark, like writing it and going, okay, what are some ways in which people expect women to be and how versus how we really are? And I just typed on my notes app, I still have it, a list. And that's the chapter headings of the book. So it was like angry, barren because we're expected to be fertile, old, young, like so old because we're expected to be young, young because we're expected to be mature. I can't remember the other chapters right now. Anyway, oh, crazy because of the mental health stigmas around women. And I just went to a book launch for Emmy Kegler, who's got a new book on mental health that's really, really good. But yeah, so like it was literally just me sitting there thinking of this. And people who've read early copies, they open up to the table of contents and they often will like report on social media that they start laughing because it's just so like the table of contents is so sparse and the words are so, yeah, it's like so strongly chosen words. But it enabled me to see each chapter as telling a story about that thing and to bring in characters from history and to weave in sociology and psychology, which is my favorite kind of writing that sort of like is interdisciplinary and blurs the boundaries, because I hate the fact that religion and spiritual writing has been siloed into like just this one little cage. So I'm always that person who's kicking at the cage and trying to get out.
Well, good for you. Good for you.
Wish me luck.
So you had the additional challenge of, trying to introduce a book during the pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about what that's been like? And, are you going to do more in-person events and things like that going forward and speaking engagements?
Maybe. Next year looks kind of questionable. Like the big event that I was going to be speaking at was Festival in Faith of Writing, which had been postponed twice, and they just pulled the plug on it again.
Yes.
So I was just kind of groaning about that to one of my writing groups on Facebook. I'm in a writing group there that we just talk about publishing and stuff like that. And it just sort of is like things are so unpredictable now. I do know some writers are trying to plan tours for next year. With a book coming out in December, though, it didn't make sense to do. Bookstores don't want you. They're like, get out of here. Like in December, we got to put these Christmas things out, right?
Yeah.
And then COVID rates are going up in California. So between those things, I was like, we'll do an online launch, but we'll make it fun, right? Like, so rather than just having me going blah, blah, blah. So my friend who is an arts journalist and hosts an interview show on the arts on community radio, and I are going to do a conversation. It's going to be recorded and edited, and then we're going to play that. And then we're going to have live trivia about things from the book, and we'll have prizes that we give away. And then I'll sit in front of my fireplace with a large snifter of kombucha or something. And because my friend Mark, who is the social media and streaming director for Glide Community Church, which is a really well-known church in San Francisco. He's like, you got to play to your strengths with streaming events, and too many of them are just, this kind of thing. And like, think about like what can keep people engaged for an hour. So this, Brian, because you put on conferences, like Q&As are more engaging than just a person talking, right? Because the people who are
work really well on Zoom, surprisingly so, because people feel like it's even more, they keep using this word intimate.
Yeah. I've been thinking about that a lot.
Big conference room, and you're a long ways away from the speaker, whereas in this, you're almost like the speaker's right in front of you.
Yes. Plus we're at home, right? So you can see, and I've redecorated about 8 times over the course of the pandemic. Like you can see, this is like, if I turn the camera just a little bit, there's a litter box and like a big pile of laundry, but like it is closer to, if we were having this talk on stage at a conference, people would be looking at their phones, and they may be doing that when they watch this, but you're right. There is a degree of immediacy that's missing from those kind of generic. I've never been to Festival of Faith and Writing, but I would imagine it's a great event. I may never go.
It's huge.
But it's huge, right? Like, so is it like 10,000 people?
2,000, I think.
Okay, so I go to Associated Writing Programs Conference, also known as AWP, and that's 20,000 people.
Whoa.
And I've spoken on panels at that, and I just felt like, who cares? Like I'm on a panel with Jeff Charlotte, best-selling author. Like no one's care what I say. Jeff is like why they came, right? And so I really think that online events, and then also the accessibility for COVID risk averse people, but also people in different time zones. So I can do one event for people in Central, East Coast, and California time, put it on YouTube, and then they can watch it whenever they want.
Mm-hmm.
Stuff like that just feels much better to me right now than getting on a plane. And but I will do one. I'm speaking at one local at First Congregational Church in January here in Berkeley. The pastor there is another author, Molly Baskett, and she, she's like, your book's perfect for our congregation, plus she endorsed my book. So I'm like, great, and I'm donating the money from that event to the Oakland LGBTQ Center
Nice.
as a fundraiser. Yeah. Nice. So any money that is earned from events, I announced already is going to be donated to trans and LGBTQ organizations, because one of the points in the book is like we have to expand our definition of gender. So I'm doing one event, and then my friend is coming out here to do an event from New York, and so we're trying to get a conversation event going, but nothing formal on that yet. And then I'm supposed to speak at Notre Dame sometime next year. That again got canceled and rescheduled so many times. So I would say that it was really hard for people whose books came out last year, but it remains difficult now because people are sort of hoping that we can return to the way it was before. But the truth is that those kinds of events don't really work for a lot of people now, the kind where you have to fly and spend money and like be in a crowded room. Not everybody wants to do that.
Sure.
And so we have to be mindful of that as authors too, because there is pressure to do in-person events, but it's kind of like, where do you live? What do you feel like your limits are? When is your book coming out? Like I said, December, nobody wants to go to book events in December. Yeah.
Tough time.
So I would say that we'll see how it goes. But my encouragement is that in the past, my books have had a long tail. People still write to me about Radical Reinvention, which came out 10 years ago. And they go, I found it in a bookstore. My friend mentioned it, and it's still selling, not a ton, but, and the Nuns book is used in seminaries and classrooms. And so that has gotten me speaking invitations. So if this one takes a while to get out there, that's okay,
It does have a lasting topic. I mean, it's going to be relevant, I think, for quite some time, unfortunately, right? I mean,
yeah. And also with, that's another thing writers need to think about is like, if you're writing a book that is newsy, can it also have a long tail, right? So like if you want to write a book about the pandemic, there's going to be like a million pandemic books. There's already a bunch of them. But is it something that people can use for other things? Like I would think like 5 to 10 years out. Your publisher's like, right now it's got to be like the launch matters so much. And I'm like, actually, that's not everything. It actually kind of takes a little longer.
Interesting. So what would you say your biggest hope is for this book?
I just hope that it finds the right readers. Like I said before, I'm less concerned with the most readers. I'm more concerned. I'd like to earn back my advance. That'd be great, because any royalties that I make, I'm also going to donate.
Wow.
And to LGBTQ causes. Yeah, it's very important. This book sort of radicalized me even further towards the idea of gender being, like problematic the way we treat it right now. But the right readers, meaning that people who, again, see it as a conversation, see it as a chance to open up a conversation. I've already had a couple, again, early readers who are like, I gave it to my sister, I gave it to my husband, I gave it to, my daughter. And like, that means so much to me. When Krista Tippett endorsed it and she said, I'm going to give it to my mother and my daughter, I was like, well, even if she's just saying that, which I hope it's not true, but like that meant so much to me, because
Sure.
even if, someone I really respect, and that's what I mean by the right readers. If Krista Tippett's daughter likes my book, that's wonderful. That means more to me than being on Oprah's Super Soul Sunday in a lot of ways. Although that would be nice too, especially because I'm donating all the money. So call me.
There you go. There you
yeah.
go. Cool. So I know this might be premature, but do you have any ideas for future books that you can talk about at all?
I can talk sort of like vaguely, because we may or may not be actually moving forward with one, which is sort of like, again, this stuff takes a long time. People imagine like you get, like this publisher's interested and then a contract shows up the next day. No, it's like 6 months of like, and then if you have an agent, there's like back and forth about money and royalties, and it takes a really long time to be able to officially say that you're writing a book. But I have been writing and thinking for a number of years now in the context of clergy abuse, but also in the context of religion in general, about forgiveness. And what that means, and how when churches or institutional bodies, like the whole Me Too thing, ask victims for forgiveness, that they're actually asking the victim to do work. And my friend Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg is writing a book on atonement, which I'm really looking forward to. And she and I were on a really great, we were both guests on an episode of this Canadian Broadcast Corporation, which is like the NPR of Canada, has a show called Tapestry, which is about religion and spirituality. And they did an episode on forgiveness. And we were both on that episode as guests. And Danya talked about in Judaism, like how atonement involves actually doing something or making amends. And I really thought about how Christians have lost that part of the story. We just sort of jump to like, forgive me, and then you owe that person forgiveness. And so I'm thinking about that issue. And I'm sure that other people have written books on the topic, but my interest is really in, again, like, how do we come up with a victim-centered theology of forgiveness? And so something like that, something, that's floating around in that world of writing. So again, I really like to boundary bust. So mixing research, reporting, profiling people. I think it'll be something like that. So we'll see.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Kaya, thanks so much for sharing with us. You do such interesting work and groundbreaking work and important work. And I really, I'm glad to help tell the world about it.
Thanks, Brian. And again, I appreciate what you do too. Like it's, from talking to a lot of spiritual writers that we often sort of have a chip on our shoulder about like the fact that we're sort of siloed into this little bubble, but you're helping us to find ways to like find each other within that bubble and then hopefully break out of it.
Absolutely. Well, I couldn't ask for more, of that to happen for sure.
Yeah.
So again, everyone, you can find more about Kaya and her book at www.oakstown.org, OAKESTOWN.org. So Kaya, thank you again for joining us. Really such a pleasure.
Okay. Thanks, Brian.